A lot of Christians don't actually worship Jesus. They worship John Wayne in a robe. Let's talk about it. Hi, I'm Colton. I grew up a Pentecostal pastor's kid, went to school to get degrees in historical Christian theology, and I want to talk about how some churches are actually preparing people not for faithfulness, but for fascism. There's a historian from Calvin University named Kristen Kobes Du Mez who wrote a book called Jesus and John Wayne, How White Evangelicals Corrupted a Faith and Fractured a Nation. You should definitely pick it up and read it. In the book, she talks about how American evangelicals replaced Jesus with an image of a rugged and militant form of masculinity, one that modeled less of the Gospels and more Cold War propaganda, action movies, and military heroism. She shows how churches that idolized people like John Wayne and Ronald Reagan taught generations of Christians that the highest virtue wasn't compassion or humility, but instead things like toughness or being dominant or having control. Du Mez says that they didn't just teach people to idolize this kind of masculinity, but they began to project it on the Jesus that they were reading in the scripture, even when it wasn't coherent to do that. But she says that this version of Jesus didn't just show up on accident, that it was built intentionally through sermons and books and men's conferences, purity culture, and really just decades of fear-mongering. In this subculture, men were taught that godliness meant dominance, and women were taught that submission was sacred. And churches became more like boot camps for patriarchal power, where instead of spiritual formation for discipleship, there was spiritual malformation towards authoritarianism. It reminds me of this quote from this sort of like deviant, perverted, creep megachurch pastor named Mark Driscoll, where he said that his version of Jesus was a pride fighter with a commitment to make someone bleed. He said that's the guy he can worship. And I remember him saying that I cannot worship the hippie, diaper, halo Christ because I cannot worship a guy that I can beat up. But buddy, he literally didn't fight back. He got the shit kicked out of him and then literally told his boys not to squabble up. And then as they hung him up to die, he literally was asking God to forgive the people for doing it. And look, if your idea of Jesus couldn't get curb stomped, then it's not Jesus. It's John Wayne. But Du Mez points out that this idea didn't stay inside the church. It shaped those people's politics. Because look, when pastors insist that real men lead and submission by women is godly, they're not just talking about households. They're actually building a worldview, one that sees hierarchy as sacred and obedience as holy, and questioning that authority as rebellion. So it's no surprise then that so many of these same churches embrace Trump with almost a messianic zeal, not in spite of his cruelty and bravado, but because of it. Du Mez says that evangelicals didn't simply tolerate Donald Trump because he promised to deliver on their policy agenda, but rather he was the culmination of their values, a tough and ruthless man, unafraid to do whatever needed to be done. But the Jesus of the Gospels, the one that Christians are supposed to follow and emulate, wasn't a warlord. He wasn't power hungry. He was a servant. He washed feet. He wept out of empathy for the people around him in mourning. He told Peter to put away his sword. He rode into town humble on a donkey, and he let himself be killed rather than kill to survive. The early church didn't follow him because he was dominant and powerful. They followed him because he was good, and because in his weakness, they saw the power of God.